through that. Then our friend Tony D'Amato. Tony is professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology and director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. Tony received his Bachelor of Science in Forest Ecosystem Science from the University of Maine, Master of Science in Forest Science from Oregon State University, and his PhD in Forest Resources from the University of Massachusetts. He was a faculty member for 7 years at the University of Minnesota and Bullard Fellow at Harvard University's Harvard Forest prior to joining the University of Vermont in January 2015. I think I speak for most of us here in the forest community in Vermont, sharing with you that we're all really super glad he came. Please welcome Tony D'Amato.
Thanks, Mike. And there's always time like this presentation to change that opinion. In terms of the title, this really evolved from an email I got about would you come speak at NEASF about maybe ecological forestry or climate smart forestry or adaptive silviculture. And so I thought those are all really good adjectives to describe things. And I think we're using those adjectives a lot to describe what we do. But I think a lot of the conversation we're having right now is no matter how we describe this, and no matter how progressive and thoughtful we think this is, there's still cut stumps to many people that they don't like. And so I think, part of what I'm hoping to do today is definitely dig in a little bit in ecological silviculture, largely because that's kind of the core of what was presented yesterday as part of the presentation is, we want to move forward with more wood production in the region, and ecological silviculture is the way to do that. But just getting us a little bit squared on both kind of where that came from, a little bit of history on it, because I think there's some important stories to even where we are today in that history. But also kind of what are we talking about when we see ecological silviculture? Because not all silviculture is ecological silviculture. And so kind of how we piece that together. And I'll certainly be intersecting with a lot of the social too, because that's really the challenge that we're dealing with. So to start, and many are familiar with this, but I think as a region, we should take pride that unless you're from Yale or mad that another Ivy League gets to claim this, that the term ecological forestry in the forestry literature first showed up in New England. And so in 1942, this paper was published by Spur and Klein called Ecological Forestry in Central New England, really where they argued that if we're going to be doing silviculture, we should be following nature as far as possible. And the genesis of this, many know the history of the Harvard Forest when it was a forestry school, like other forestry schools spent the first couple decades fighting nature. How do we kind of use this top-down command and control approach to get white pine everywhere? And over time, we're like, gosh, these sites keep coming back as oak, and we're kind of observing disturbances happening in natural forests. And there might be something there to learn from to guide what we're doing. An important caveat to this is the first time that we talked about this in the forestry literature, but obviously working with ecology and working with the site traditionally was in the landscape for millennia, prior to us thinking about how to work with the forest. And so this is certainly our history from a forestry profession, but we really ignored a lot of the voices that were already there about how to work with the land, how to be reciprocal, how to think about being ecological, and ironically, chose Germany as a place to solve our local problems in terms of, it's always a weird kind of irony. We went there to figure out what to do here. So besides just this being nice to say, hey, they talked about ecological forestry in 1942, I think what's also interesting as we think about kind of where we are today is that a key kind of statement in this publication is that they really are lamenting at that time that we've learned so much ecologically. Yet when we think about forestry and how it's being classified both in policies, both in how we're doing it, it's still being viewed as that forestry is the planting of pine. And so there's this kind of monolith of what we do. We're there to produce an output. We're there to kind of enforce our will on the system, was prevalent then. And I'd argue, obviously, 82 years later, we've learned even that much more about ecology. And so maybe we should be leaning into that as much as we can. But I think when we talk about the history of ecological silviculture, think about the Pacific Northwest. That's where it comes from. Again, I always like to push back and say, no, it was here first. But that's where certainly it erupted. And basically, it was Jerry Franklin, many folks are really working more from the ecological side. And I would argue a lot of that came out of that was not very useful for localizing ecological silviculture for the Northeast. I think it was more useful in just thinking about socially, where does forestry fit in and kind of how do we do things in the landscape. And so there's a lot of random great literature that I love to hold on to and look at. And there's a quote from this random statement that Franklin wrote on New Forestry that I think is really prophetic today, where basically he says foresters need to acknowledge that what is good for timber production is not always best for other values. Conversely, environmentalists must move away from preservation as a sole solution for many objectives. Incorporating ecological knowledge into management systems for compatible production of commodities and protection of ecological values is critical. This new forestry, which we now call ecological silviculture, should occupy a central place in the current debate as the basis for sharing some of the pie rather than dividing it. And, we really are in this high division stage still today. And again, when I was a student learning about this stuff in the 1998 silviculture class, Bob Seymour, it was that dividing of the pie that I wasn't interested in. It was really the sharing piece that he was talking about. This is cool, this art and science to share. How do we figure out how to actually use ecological knowledge to do things that both produce wood, but also restore and provide these amazing benefits? So if we're looking for a contemporary definition of ecological silviculture, it really integrates that early root of kind of working with the site, using an understanding of the ecosystem, an understanding of ecological dynamics to inform our silvicultural prescriptions. But importantly, it's building on what Franklin's talking about, in that we're doing that to basically support integrated objectives, environmental, economic, and social. And I think we all appreciate that, but as I start going through this, you'll recognize that oftentimes we're really being viewed as we're focused on economics, we're focused on production. You're really not providing us an additional service in what you do out there in the landscape. So there are kind of 4 operating principles of ecological silviculture. Some are already familiar with these, but I just want to enumerate them again, because we kind of usually talk about ecological silviculture. We're all doing it, but it's worth just when we talk about it as a profession, some of us think that there are some pretty specific principles we want to follow and do that. And I've deliberately used as the backdrop to this slide an excellent example of this from the Green Mountain National Forest, of them doing ecological silviculture as they do in many places on that landscape, despite what some might see as just cut stumps. And so the first principle is often where people stop and view, hey, I'm doing ecological silviculture because I'm leaving things behind. But that is a key piece of this. And it really is that legacy of that work from Mount St. Helens and other places that saw just the importance of biological legacies and kind of the pre-disturbance condition and influencing resilience and supporting biodiversity. And so that first principle of continuity is pretty clear in this picture of retaining living and dead trees, but also making sure that we don't run over that advanced regeneration of red spruce and that we're actually maintaining and carrying some of that forward. Second, the one that I think we also get on board with here is we're trying to introduce and restore and enhance some of the things that certainly was talked about in the previous presentation, that diversity and that complexity of the site. And so with our silviculture, deliberately creating complexity, which I'll point to in a minute, is very different than how we traditionally have been trained in what we do out there in the landscape. Third is timing. So, we have MPV, we have MAI, PA, all these things that are kind of dictating kind of when we want to cut and do things. And that's really being driven to some degree from the production of the forest crop, right? And that's not necessarily what's needed to grow a tree to a certain size or what's needed to get advanced regeneration of a certain species established after it's been lost from a site. And so thinking through kind of how we time things that actually are acknowledging ecological timescales, not just economic. And then finally, this idea of context. Again, we all appreciate managing across landscapes, but recognizing that our actions at the stand scale kind of interact and have influence at broader scales, and certainly becomes important as we get into adaptation. And so I'm definitely, as some know, a half rate as a silviculture instructor because I can't speak German, so I can't read the old literature. I can say famous Schlag to fit in with the cool kids, but I can't read German, but I can read English and then speak it in my bastardized Eastern Mass dialect. And so I always find it fascinating to kind of look at the adjectives we use and have used forever, in describing what's good and what's bad in silviculture and forestry. And so I've just pulled out some of the desired conditions that we always talk about. So balanced, normal, uniform, well-stocked, regulated. These are all things that, whether you're a human, a diet, or a forest, that we say are just like, that's what we should be doing. Likewise, all the old terms like irregular, unbalanced, under and overstocked, overmature, these are the things that have been codified from the early silviculture textbooks as a thing that we don't know what to deal with. That's just not a situation that we want to be working with. And I'd argue that a lot of what we talk about in ecological silviculture and a lot of what we know about natural systems is that they tend to lean into those undesirable conditions, right? Variable, complex, irregular. And so in many cases, a lot of how we think about what's a good forest and a good forest condition is almost pushing back against this notion that we want to be thinking about working with that ecosystem and emphasizing that complexity. And so many of you do ecological silviculture, you kind of have been in other parts of the country, other parts of the globe, and have looked at this. And so I don't need to belabor this, but, really we're thinking about conditions that are very different than that monolith of, pines and lines and essentially this very simple ecosystem. And I appreciated even Sam mentioning the use of Avenza. And so even the ability to be more complex and use technology in our logging has allowed some of these things that certainly when I was learning about it, people saying that's too complex to mark and lay out, the ability to actually use, handheld devices and other things to do this has really advanced our use of ecological silviculture in the landscape. So I think the rub often and has been historically with ecological silviculture is that, things have to pay their way out of the woods. Economically, we need to make sure that we're kind of maximizing that output. And so I've put forth this image that's adapted from kind of an example for the Pacific Northwest that just kind of contrasts how that site productivity is being allocated between ecological silviculture versus one that's really focused on timber production. And these are just rough percentages. I'd say that the timber focused is true. And then the left side is just me saying, let's say 40% is allocated to something other than producing wood production. And so we're leaving things out there to die. We're growing species that aren't important, at least today, economically. And I think it's important to reflect on this is that all of us in this room, we talk about this all the time. We love the forest. We all love the forest. We connect to the forest. And when I look at that 40% and reflect a lot on just what we've learned from traditional knowledge in relationship with the forest and that giving and the taking, like we amazingly are able to take trees from the woods and use them. And so I often view that 40% as kind of that giving back, right? We basically are honoring that relationship with that forest, and in many cases, kind of leaving things out there for options on the site, as well as to hopefully enhance the functioning into the future. And so when we think about our values and kind of our space that we've been evolving into, there's a lot of consistency with this idea of the giving and the taking when we're thinking, hey, you know what, 40%, 50%, that's out there for the forest, not for us. And I think it's a key element that we reflect on today with other ways of knowing. What's been interesting is I think even when I moved to Oregon from Maine, I was all excited to see ecological silviculture everywhere. I'm like, wow, I learned about this stuff in class and I can't wait to see it. And that was early 2000s. And I was like, oh, it's still the same as it was. And what's been fascinating and amazing over the last 20 years is that the growth in the level of application has gained traction, both regionally and globally. And again, we're fortunate in the Northeast to have people like Bob and Laura and others that have advocated for this for a long time. And so what you're looking at on this graph is just a recent book that basically tasked people from around the country, around the globe with developing ecological silvicultural systems for different forest types. And that included Bob Seymour and Patricia Raymond here in the Northeast. And then just the different regeneration methods they viewed as kind of key to those. And I know it's blasphemous to some that I have variable retention harvesting and variable density thinning as regeneration methods, but they are, as well as irregular shelter woods and selection. That's what I'm showing there. And so writ large, everybody's using multi-age. So we're thinking about kind of obviously that idea of continuity. And importantly, when you look at kind of the disturbance regimes where those people are working, and that's what's coded out there, if I'm working in ecosystems where infrequent severe fires are the prevailing regime, I'm probably more in the variable retention harvest mode of kind of trying to emulate that process. Whereas if I'm in this part of the world where, frequent wind disturbance is common, I'm often more into irregular methods as well as selection methods. But the point being is that it's happening in a lot of places, and we're largely seeing this manifest itself as multi-aged, certainly matched to the site. So building off of that Franklin quote, and again, I don't get royalties for every time I say how useful my silviculture class was at Maine, but this was on one of my handouts when I was a student there. The triad, it was 6 years old at the time. And I think, there's a lot that can always be learned from reflecting on this, kind of where we are today. And that's, many of us in this room are very familiar with it, but I think it doesn't get discussed enough that there's always been this thought of at least over the last 3 decades of trying to divide and share that pie. And at the time, when we thought of the triad, a lot of it was focused on how do we balance, the need for wood as well as the need for maintaining native biodiversity, which I think is really critical. But when we also think more broadly about the values we have for forests, another useful way to look at that triad and the challenge we have right now in connecting with what we do is that it also has some unique ways of looking at just the way that our values are supported. In this case, I'm going to define them via kind of 4 broad bins of ecosystem services. And I have a couple of examples of each beneath, not to say that those are the be-all, end-all examples. And so the high yield plantation portion of the triad, right, where we're really focusing on production, key part of what we're doing out there, really, although there's certainly species that use that, there's carbon there, there's things happening there. Really, the focus of the inputs is on producing wood. That is very much focused on this provisioning service of we want this output from that site. On the flip side, the ecological reserves, which are super important, provide a lot of values, right? They're providing carbon storage perspectives, biodiversity habit for the different species, cultural values, but obviously they're not, providing that commodity production. And even some have argued like gathering of plants and things is not allowed in wildland. So I'd say even some of those kind of traditional provisioning services, which shouldn't be censored but are by some, are not provided there. And so it's really that place where we share the pie, right, where we're doing ecological silviculture, that we can do all these things, and that we can really double down on the fact that we're really meeting multiple values in these spots in the ways that intersect, I think, very importantly with what other people are interested in outside of this room. And so I think it's a key thing just for us to be leaning into a bit more. And so I figured, given it's always worth just a reality check as to where we are today, and also because you're in this room and not in the public land room, I figured it'd be worth just to use some recent situation that's happened in Massachusetts as an example of where we're at, both with kind of the perspective on forestry in general, as well as this idea of both ecological and adaptive, and kind of where we're going forward. And so many know the Climate Forestry Committee was appointed by the governor. There are 12 experts. I have experts in quotes because I was one of the people on there, but everybody else knew what they were doing. And that should be in quotes too. But and you'll see that in a second. It's a very drawn out, and I think for many of us, a challenging process. But there are kind of two things that really struck me, and I'll kind of stick to those two things here in a second. The first is one of the most profound and disturbing things that's codified in that report is this quote, where committee opinion on wood production differed profoundly. And the ... is our opinion in this room, that we should probably cut some wood in Massachusetts, particularly in public land, because that's what a great example for stewardship. But others argued that our forests are better suited for removing and storing carbon, and those elsewhere should produce Massachusetts needs. That's codified. You can all find it online. And so this illusion that we're trying to move beyond, is pretty strong right there. And again, Bob Seymour's talked about for a long time this biad, right, where people are good with us producing wood, but they're not, but they're not good with kind of this integrated piece. I think is pretty well reflected here. I'd say it's maybe kind of the colonial version of the biad. But more importantly, the committee in general, those that didn't want Massachusetts wood produced there don't really care how it's produced. They just don't want to be there, right? And I think that's a bigger issue, in that even that narrative that we can do this really well and do it kind of locally and do it in ways that are kind of using expertise of biologists and foresters and others to come to bear was not resonating. And so I'd say that, there's this huge disconnect that includes a couple of scientists that say this is the best course forward for Massachusetts. The reason I bring that up is that I think, as much as some are like, I don't like ecological silviculture, this is all kind of new age stuff, and we need to stick to the old ways. I'm not against that, but I would also argue we need to be a little bit real that not all of our wood's being produced with silviculture. I mean, a lot of it isn't being produced with silviculture. And so when someone makes a statement that Massachusetts shouldn't produce wood, they're also saying they're okay with it coming from wherever it comes from, right? And I think that's a real problem. But we need to speak to well, there's some value in doing good management on the landscape. And so to point to that, I'll just rely on this. I know there's problems with some of the approaches used, but this is some work that Ethan Belair and Mark Ducey did, where they used FIA data. Again, not the perfect way to summarize silviculture outcome, but looked at kind of recent harvested plots and described, what's happened across the landscape. Locations are fuzzed roughly, but you can get a feel for what's going on out there. What I did is just collapse these down. So I took commercial clear cutting and high grading put that in the not silviculture category, as it isn't. And then the remainder is obviously what it is, which is silviculture. And so, everybody in this room does great silviculture, does a good job, but there's a lot of wood that's being produced that's not silviculture. And so when we think through our ethics and our values across the landscape and kind of being able to support these things, we need to lean into the fact that we can do this better with these approaches. And so the previous couple of talks, I think, were good to set this up, and that, we do need to be adaptive, clearly, right? And again, we have a lot of great people in this room, as well as in the region, with NIAX and others that are really leading the way, kind of helping us think about how do we take these ideas from ecological silviculture and now think about them in an adaptive framework. And this figure is just kind of basically showing on the y-axis kind of the relevance of our past experience and the relevance of historic conditions and how that changes over time. And so we sit here today and we all can say, like, this is very different than last year and different than 10 years ago. And so we're kind of moving down this trajectory where things are changing quite rapidly. But there is this growing kind of pushback on this idea, and I think Chris and Amanda's presentation was great, that we need to do something. We need to adapt. We need to kind of engage. Again, back to the report that you all should read. The other piece I got from that report is that we don't all agree on this, that we need to be actually engaging and adaptively managing. And so this quote, there was significant disagreement on the Climate Forestry Committee regarding the ability and merit of active forest management to increase forest resilience or adapt forests to future conditions. Some argued vociferously that the long history of forest change and recovery from historic changes indicate nothing needs to be done to make forests more resilient. So there's a lot of issues in that, just in terms of where we sit today, but I also is symptomatic to some degree of even how we talk about why we're adapting, and I'll get to that in a second. But what we do see, and Tessa McGann's work kind of showed this pretty clearly, is that sooner or later, whether it's at a local site or in a region, we do kind of cross this threshold where it's not looking like the forest I'm used to. And it's getting to a point where, from a desirable condition standpoint, writ large, it's not in a place that's good. And I think even the spongy moth work that was shown with the ex-urban site is a good example of that. And so you get into this kind of novelty domain, and we're seeing it with southern pine beetle in places like Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, where people are kind of largely supportive of cutting to try to deal with that. We see it in areas where we have kind of tremendous impacts of invasives and emerald ash borer, but where we start seeing at least this broader acceptance of adaptation. But our goal, I think, as a community is to be ahead of that curve, right? Can we actually do things before we cross this threshold? And so a point I'll make, and this really builds on the carbon stewardship work that NIAX has been talking about for a long time now, is that when we're describing kind of why we're doing adaptation, we're not doing it to make it so that forest can be resilient in the future for that forest's sake, right? We're doing it so it can be resilient for the values that we care about from that forest. And it's a very different thing. And so this y-axis is just hypothetically values tied to carbon, aesthetics, mature conditions that someone might have for a forest. And so one option is, we don't do anything, kind of allow that forest to keep progressing. And of course, it's going to keep getting older and evolving. And the other is that we intervene and cut some trees, right? So basically, we are creating cut stumps. We're doing it in an adaptive way. They still don't like it, but we're doing it. And the idea is that we're trying to kind of implement some of that complexity and diversity and some of these values into the system. And then, lo and behold, something is introduced, something occurs, we have a novel stressor show up. And so if that forest where no action is occurring is in a vulnerable state, right, basically it's really, really vulnerable, there's a potential that's going to change dramatically, right? And this is where we get in trouble. That forest ultimately will become resilient again, right? It can be buckthorn shrub fields. It can be, Asiatic bittersweet all over everything and nothing else. That's super resilient ecologically. That's the problem that we have here. Resilience can be good or bad, right? But in terms of resilience for our values, that's not a good thing. And so really what we're trying to do is maintain resilience of the things that we care about from forests through this intervention. So it's a minor semantic intercommunication that I think is critical as we kind of move forward and try to build that license. So how to move forward, just to finish this. So one key is, again, I mentioned the rub with ecological silviculture is that if you're telling me I need to leave 40% behind for the good of the land, for the good of the ecosystem, like how do I do that with a 7% return on investment, right? And those that have heard Roger Milliken talk about his experience and career with Bascahegan is beautifully articulated. This the struggle there, right? Where essentially we are beholden to potentially some fiduciary responsibilities, but also love the forest and kind of how do we give back? And so both Bascahegan as well as Appalachian Mountain Club, large landowners in Maine have been good examples of where kind of carbon incentives have provided an opportunity to kind of dampen that fiduciary pressure to give back to the land. And so it's certainly one pathway forward. The other is that, again, that Massachusetts Climate Forestry Committee, that comment just shows that those two individuals, I'm getting close to naming them, but I'm not, just don't care where their wood comes from as long as it's not where they are. And so they are basically accepting like pretty poor practice. So there's a lot of work, being led by folks with UNH Extension right now, really trying to work with builders and architects to try to get them to get the value of wood and where it comes from. Obviously, it's been there before with certification standards, but not every ownership is certified. And so finding ways to just get people to pay more and actually value wood that's being produced in a way that's sustainable as opposed to just not near where they are. The second piece is that, there's a lot of lands, and again, I deliberately use public lands often as examples of ecological silviculture because they don't deserve the heat they're getting right now in many cases, because they, in many are a great example of the models for that practice. But so it's less about like the fiduciary side, and it's more about the trust piece. And again, I hate to say that over and over again, we all say it, but we all trust each other. But I would say writ large, forestry, they think there's an agenda. My office is lined with dollar bills from industry, just finding ways to get more wood out. That's just what I do as a forestry professor. And so I think, part of that is laying into those plural values. Really understanding that people love the woods for different reasons, and I think this sharing of the pie is one opportunity to actually show that we love it as well in similar ways and connecting. And as much as we tell everybody we need to tell our own story, I feel like it's better when others that are more trusted tell our story. And so just the people like Audubon, TNC, others that have, I think, really been powerful allies to say, hey, good stewardship is also good for the values we have. And then I think the last piece is that, we're pretty apologetic sometimes for what isn't good management, and I think if we want people to value exemplary stewardship, we need to be comfortable saying, hey, a lot of that wood's not coming from a good place. If you don't want to come from there, number one, let's figure out ways both ecologically, economically, and from a policy standpoint to do that. And so given you all want to scatter quickly to lunch, I'll end kind of by lobbing like a blasphemous grenade into the room. I only see one silviculture instructor in the room right now, so it will only offend others, is that, even when we think about, how we define silviculture, like controlling nature and you're really kind of this objective driven piece, really is ignoring kind of our relationship with the land, kind of that reciprocity. And it's also ignoring all we've been talking about is that it's not certain. How could we even say we could control at this point? I mean, it's just I think a pretty arrogant thing. We can't control. And so I'll hide behind the lead author because I'm only one of many authors. So I'll hide behind all of them. But there's been some suggestion that maybe we need to move to a new definition of silviculture that really kind of leans into that relationship and that reciprocity that I think all of us feel, but often are afraid to kind of acknowledge, and that we do love the forest. And so that art and science of supporting and stewarding forests and woodland ecosystems and their ability to adapt. So really acknowledging this is not controllable, while best meeting the diverse suite of desired values held by landholders, rights holders, communities, and societies. And so it's really about like making sure that we are relevant to those values. And Mark even mentioned it, in his really well ad-libbed, presentation yesterday, that like providing that diverse value, but doing it in ways that show that relationship and that reciprocity is critical if we do really want to grow that middle ground and share that pie going forward. So I'll let you all leave this grenade and go to lunch.
We can try to squeeze in a few questions if you're all willing. Take it away. Hands, questions? Reciprocal
Hey, Bill.
grenades?
Sure, you challenge detractors on their thought process. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, the committee, and enough cannot be said about Susan Cooper and Kurt, what they did in terms of wrangling. I don't know, Christopher was also, we did have a real expert. Christopher was on the committee. But it was clearly a division in that committee. And again, I think they viewed to the trust piece, any of us that either had a CF next to our name or were tied to forestry, that we had our own kind of agenda. And then in many cases, there were some pretty dominant academic bullying that happened in that room that people kind of kowtowed to. And I think, so to my point, I can't belittle some that really view the world solely through carbon. And like, so if they see like the stocking Massachusetts forest and view high stocking, like how could we dare cut that in our backyard? But they really were blind and very vocal and more than one, I guess, is a bigger fear in that they didn't think Massachusetts forests should support the kind of the regional wood needs. And I think so much so that it didn't even get that, like the objectives and the mission and all these things that are tied to the Massachusetts state agencies really are part of what's guiding that. And this is about as sustainable as you could possibly ask for. And so I think it was just it was a fundamental difference of opinion. The resilience piece was really frustrating. And actually, I wasn't in the country when that part was being debated. So I sent some comments, and I was talking to people in another part of the world. and they were dumbfounded that that was even being debated. And so I think we also suffer a little bit from some have like long running conflict with Mass DCR and others that just kind of were finding many ways to be obstructionists on pieces of this that I think are unfortunate. But and maybe again, I'd say we articulated sometimes poorly that we think the forest is going to be resilient. Like we might not like what it kind of bounces into, but that it's more about the values that we have. And I think it's, sometimes when we separate ourselves from the forest all the time, we might not convey that across. But yeah, so I'm still grappling with it. I think all of us, I mean, there was definitely some conversations like, wow, that's really being had right now. So yeah.
This is kind of a rhetorical thing to say, but we know some of the people that were on there that have spoken eloquently about the idea of balancing these values.
Yeah.
And to turn it back.
It was frustrating. Yeah, very much so. And I think, part of it is there's movement, there's waves of movement, and people get excited about like everybody's on board with one way of thinking all of a sudden. And yeah, I agree. And thankfully that one is not in the other camp. We ultimately called them out on that. But yeah, I think it is unfortunate. Wildlands and Woodlands started in Massachusetts, right? I mean, that began, Brian I remember sitting across from you with Dave Kittredge. I mean, that was, so yeah, it was kind of strange. Yeah.
We have breaking news that the lunch room is not quite ready, so we do have a little more time. Keep it going.
Oh, no. Andy, you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some commentary. The only thing that's amazing to me this day and age is the fact that the principal motive drivers are not much different today than they were 20 or 30 years ago. But the problem is today is not 20 or 30 years ago. We don't have the luxury of have time and resource and other societal interests. I think a little bit, we just need a paradigm shift, which mostly means all of us that are about over age 35 probably should die. And then the rest of you gotta get to reality real fast.
No, I hear you though.
No, I mean, there are people, I'm being hyperbolic, but I think, I'm just amazed that you guys talk, there are people who, I mean, my view of forestry could basically climate change is radically shifting. I could embrace plantations in a way, but I could 30 years ago, but today I can embrace them in a big way. That 10 years ago, I wouldn't relate to myself. I can embrace actually ecological reserves and not ecological reserves, ecological forestry in a whole different way as a result as well. It's a whole different word. And that's one of our biggest challenges, really actually how to help people understand it. Our reality today is we have a non-stationary environment that everybody thinks really acts on stationary. And it's hard enough just to actually convey what you're trying to convey here. I think the slight hope is sometimes these deep conversations reveal that we have very different worldviews. But when you get deep into the values, we actually share some very core, important fundamental values. And it's really hard to get people to do that work. And there's all kinds of things we can hear about, like, wow, that's interesting. This person who's, NRA all the way and anti-gun rights are very pro-gun rights. Like they get together and talk, and they actually agree on some things. And I think it's that kind of intent. I'll be quiet.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great, yeah. Good.
So I understand all comments, especially that. But I'm also concerned that we as professionals in this opportunity here, that, look at forestry as a service profession, those are the actions. I think we ought to effectively look at, how we work to build trust, why, those are just crazy, I think we're gonna miss something like that from that report from. And I think that we need to do a much better job at looking at our profession and saying, okay, why is there a lack of trust, especially now? And I think part of that is being protective as a profession in some ways that that we've heard for all these years. I think that some of that's well deserved, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the trust piece is huge. And I think also, it's just it's a weird, all this, like in particular, accelerated with both, greater concern around climate change, but also like the vacuum created by people sitting in their home and nothing else to do but like blog spaces and kind of accentuating some of the kind of anti, management on public lands, et cetera, message. And I think the challenge that some of us face, and I think it's not just that we're hamstrung maybe by our personalities, that we're not always going to be the ones that are out there, although certainly some people do an awesome job, and we'll hear about that later today, like how people are communicating and building that trust, but also that sometimes the other side is not like bound by like, I'm always like, well, my objective opinion is this because that's my job. I can't say like, this is my bias, and so I think some of those folks that are kind of scientists, but also like kind of in that blog space, where they can keep moving it and kind of pushing back, it's tricky. And so I think I agree there's common ground and shared values, but there's also, I get concerned, there's a lot to lose on that side if they say they're wrong, and will they ever say there's a space for it? I think right now, the shift is largely, oh, well, just don't cut public land, we don't mind private land being managed. But then they show kind of pictures, Andy's point, of like Mississippi plantations, kind of like, intensive production for doing that, which again is kind of missing like what we're talking about here, which is there are these ways to do things differently. And so I think, yeah, we need to do a lot of kind of building bridges and building values out there. But I do have some concern with like the fake news element to this as well, that like as a scientist, I can't like rebut and say, every time they kind of twist facts in terms that's wrong. So I think it's as we all know, not as simple as that. And some of these groups don't want to be wrong ever, right? Just because if they're wrong, then they lose their, like the people that are paying them to, that is to preserve, right? So I think but I agree. I mean, we need to look for those shared values, but maybe in those trusted common ground groups, as opposed to, some that have made a lot of headaches up here in Vermont as well.
Clearly, there's lots more to come here to discuss, but I'm told we do have to clear out now. So please, one more round for all four of our speakers.
Hey, yes, yes. Good to see you. I know. Yeah, congratulations on your engagement and everything. I never know who I'm going to see here. Well, it says another SAF meeting in the woods. That was the last time I ran into you. I haven't been